Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Triumph and tragedy, love and loss, murder and malice in the lives of 5 15th century queens, described by a woman described by the Sunday Express as no less than the queen of history writing. That woman herself is Alison Weir. The book is called Queens at War, and I'm delighted to say that Alison joins me now to take a deep dive into the women behind the throne. Alison, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles.
Good to have you with us. We're looking at one of my favourite periods of history, the 15th century. We're talking Plantagenets, we're talking War of the Roses. Set the scene, please, about why we haven't heard about the royal queens.
Well, we have in various different individual biographies, but I wanted to look at a period in which queens are involved in wars in one way or another. And some of them were involved in the 100 Years' War, which ended in 1453. And of course, then the Wars of the Roses, which began 2 years later. And it's a fascinating period. It's the concluding volume in my quartet on England's medieval queens. And in some ways, I think it's the most dramatic.
And of course, people might think that the queens were just sort of wearing long sleeve frocks and having a lovely time at court, but they really were the powerhouses, if you will. When the kings were off bashing the French or bashing each other, of course it was the queens who held sway, who held court.
Well, it was, yes, but in the case of Henry VI, who wasn't keen on bashing the French at all, Margaret of Anjou did the bashing, but that was against Richard, Duke of York, his opponent in the Wars of the Roses. She was the person who, the go-getter in that marriage. Henry wasn't. She raised and led armies. She was an incredible woman. Elizabeth Woodville was someone very strong. She was the first commoner to become queen since the Norman conquest, and that marriage caused a scandal. And yet she was incredibly influential, but also incredibly unpopular, and has been the subject of various calumnies that have since fortunately been disproved. Because
here's the thing, of course, the Joan of Navarre, Catherine of Valois, Margaret of Anjou. This is marriage as a political weapon,
yes,
as to bring people together. Yes. But with a commoner, of course, there is no agency in there. There's no. I mean, that's a marriage for love, surely. And those things don't happen if you're a king or a queen.
They don't, but they did in the case of Edward IV, and there are lots of stories about how she wouldn't say yes to him, so he either said he held a dagger to her throat. There's one story that she held a dagger to her throat and said her virtue was more important. And in the end, of course, he asked her to marry him in secret. And when this came out, oh my goodness, all hell erupted. Everybody, because marrying for love was seen in those days by the upper classes as akin to insanity. He threw away every advantage he had of making a political marriage.
So where do you sort of start with this one then, and how do you sort of plot a narrative? Because I mean, it is looking at the women's lives within that, and painting a sort of a three-dimensional picture rather than the sort of two-dimensional that we have, because we scandalously, up until recently, have overlooked women in the history when we're reporting on basically any history, if you like, from 1066 through to 1936.
That's true. That very much used to be the case. Fortunately, women's histories have been retrieved a lot in the past decades. But you need to give some context for the story, and you literally tell their stories. But I didn't want to write potted biographies. I wove them together because a lot of the lives overlap. And I didn't include a lot of the academic stuff because you need to keep the narrative pacey. And there are 5 biographies in one book. All of these queens could have had a separate biography.
When you say sorry, after you.
Well, you have to decide what is you need to tell the story. You need to give the important information, but what detail do you put in? I think it's in the detail we often get the wider picture.
Of course, one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to as the Americans say, compartmentalize, our monarchs. So we think that, when one king dies, then it's, a clean sweep. It's like a guillotine or an axe coming down on somebody's head, and we're into the next one. But of course, that isn't the case. I mean, you have to look at the sort of the Boleyns. I know it's a little bit later, but you see what I'm saying here. They all know each other. They all intertwine. They don't suddenly all leave court and then, when a king dies. I mean, they are around and about.
That's absolutely true. Although when government is done in a personal sense with a monarch, it's personal rule, things do change. They shift very dramatically if the character of the king is very different from that of his predecessor or a queen. And of course, the case of Henry V, a very strong warrior king, died prematurely of dysentery, left a 10-month-old son, Henry VI. Henry VI was nothing like his father. In fact, the complete opposite, and the worst king England would have had at a time when she was sliding into political anarchy.
So
and he was subject to the rule of factions.
Yeah, exactly. Are queens important then in keeping the factions kind of at bay? I mean, if you've got basically a queen regent, as you would have in the case of Henry V, or a little bit earlier when Richard II comes to the throne and he's wrapped in cotton wool as well. Are the queens important in continuing, if you like, the safeguarding or keeping the kingmakers, keeping the people who would be king in check?
Well, if your name's Margaret of Anjou, then it's unfortunately you back the faction that's causing the most problems, and that seemed to be what she did. And when it came to, and she was involved in a power struggle with Richard, Duke of York, the king's cousin, who also had a claim to the throne. And it wasn't until 1460 that he pressed that claim. In the years leading up to that, he tried to, take power when Henry VI was mentally ill. And tried to restore good government, but was thwarted by Margaret at nearly every turn because she espoused the faction of his enemies and tried to overthrow him, tried to neutralise his power. He was doing the same to her. She was never regent, but she really ruled England at one point.
And of course, the other thing is we kind of forget because we look at Europe now as different nation states, but obviously the kings of England have more than a passing claim to France, and an awful lot of the English nobility have lands in France. They have lands all over the place. But you see where I'm coming from here. So there's that, that there is that intermingling, and it's not just thinking of England's ending at the Channel. I mean, a lot of it has. I mean, let's not go back. I mean, Eleanor obviously evacuated a little bit earlier, but you see where I'm coming from here.
I do, yes. And you've got three queens here whose marriages were made effectively to advance England's cause in the 100 Years' War. Joan of Navarre, because the friendship of Brittany was essential. She was Duchess of Brittany, Dowager Duchess of Brittany, and she was essential. It was essential in England's war with France to have that ally. And then Catherine of Valois, through that marriage, Henry V was able to claim the crown of France and that's why Henry VI was King of France when his grandfather Charles VI died. He didn't last very long because, as I said, the 100 Years' War ended in 1453. And Margaret of Anjou, of course, we call her a French princess, but of course she comes from a different territory. It's not quite the King of France is her father's overlord, but she's still French to all intents and purposes. And it's a marriage meant to bring peace. It doesn't bring peace. In fact, there's an escalation of the war, and it doesn't go well for England. England lost.
Joan of Navarre, I'm sitting in Spain. I mean, Navarre is one of the, because there isn't such thing as a unified Spain at this point, no. To put it mildly. In fact, there was probably a bit of sort of reconquest going on the sidelines as well. So
there was, yep.
So Navarre is one of the prized kingdoms then of Spain. What's her value then to English matchmakers?
Well, her value is more as Duchess of Brittany than as a Princess of Navarre, because she had married very young, married the Duke of Brittany. He died, she'd borne him 8 children, and she made a very capable regent for her eldest son. And then of course, she looks as if she may have made advances to Henry IV, for a marriage. But he was definitely keen, and this marriage came about. A lot of negotiations were done in secret, but he could see the advantage. That she would be, that Brittany had a good relationship in the preceding century or so with England, intermarried with the royal family, and this friendship was teetering on the brink. And Henry thought he could harness, the alliance with Brittany against France.
But the only problem with that is, of course, because Henry IV is a usurper, and there's nothing worse than a usurper king, because that gets people going. Oh well, he's not the real king. Richard II is the real king, and that's why they have to bury him several times just to prove he's not still around somewhere.
That's what happened with Richard II, of course, whom he deposed and almost certainly had murdered, because there were pretenders, who claimed to be Richard II. And even Richard II's little widow, the Queen Isabella Valois, was involved in a plot to kill Henry IV. That's in the previous book. It's not in this book. But no, he's got real problems, dynastic problems, and also problems with his nobility, and then also he becomes really ill quite early. He's only married to Joan for 2 years before he starts to get this mysterious disease that has him screaming in pain and crying that he's on fire. Their only child has died at birth, and this is probably the reason why they never have another one.
So when it comes to I mean, everybody waxes lyrical about Henry V, and but he only really fights 2 battles. One at Shrewsbury when he gets hit in the face with an arrow, and the other one, Harfleur, the siege, and then we have Agincourt, which obviously is hot-wired into the DNA and everything. But that's it. And then he comes back and everything's rosy. And then he forgets to wash his hands and he goes down with dysentery. That of course.
Not quite like that, because he besieged Normandy for a very long time, from 1419, and he besieged Meaux, and he campaigned in France for some years, and in fact, it was such a harsh campaign that the people of France probably regarded him and his army as they did in the 40s, as they would have done the Nazis. So he was pretty ruthless, especially at the siege of Rouen.
So where does that leave then after sort of post Henry the Fifth and this where we come on to these I mean, I'm presuming that Anne Neville, and excuse my ignorance because there's a lot of it, is Anne Neville also commoner then, as well as Elizabeth Wydeville?
Anne Neville is probably the queen about whom we know the least of all these 5 queens, because she doesn't really have a voice. We have no letters from her, and she's. But we don't quite know the truth of her relationship with Richard of Gloucester, whom she married, later Richard III, of course. But there's one clue, and it is the fact that Richard colluded with Edward IV and his brother, the Duke of Clarence, to split the Warwick inheritance between them. Anne was the daughter of the Warwick, the kingmaker, the Earl of Warwick, who had been killed in battle at Barnet. And she and her sister were his co-heiresses. Clarence had married the sister, and he wants to keep everything for himself. He hid Anne in a London house as a cookmaid. I mean, you can't make this up. And Richard of Gloucester found her and took her to sanctuary for safety and married her. And there was a huge row between the brothers that went on and on and on for about 2 years as to who were to have that inheritance, because it should have been split equally between the two. And then but of course their mother was still living and she was the rightful inheritor. And so Edward IV passed an act in which his brothers colluded, and it devolved the Warwick inheritance upon them in equal shares. The Countess was declared legally dead. She was still very much alive and complaining to anyone who would listen. And Richard and Anne are living in Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. She's shut up there with them under Richard's protection. We'll put that in inverted commas. And Anne colluded in this harshness. We know this from the Warwick chronicler, John Russ, who was sympathetic to the Nevilles. And so we know this. It's firsthand. He was very sympathetic. He was very complimentary to Anne Neville. That gives us a clue to her character, I think,
because she is a sympathetic character because she has queenly.
I think she's unsympathetic,
right?
Because if you collude in treating your mother like that, again, yes.
I mean, do you think perhaps as many 21st century sort of readers will or amateur historians will have been coloured by, and here it comes, spoiler, like the Game of Thrones sort of reference, because everybody's colluding against each other and knocking each other off, and there's poisonings and there's interscene war and there's regicide and there's patricide and there's all sorts of stuff going on. I mean, is it as dangerous? Because I mean, it would. You would have thought that Anne would have been packed off to a nunnery or something like that, or something, or a la the Anjou into a country house castle and lived about a very sort of 20 years being waited on hand and foot, but not allowed to leave, house arrest, if you will.
Well, Margaret of Anjou did end up like that at one point. Richard, Duke of York, was banished her to Windsor, where Henry VI was ill. And, try and govern without, get on with the government of England without her interfering. That didn't last very long because she was not the sort of woman to just sit there doing nothing. And later on, after Edward IV had become victorious, her husband had been murdered in the Tower, her son had been killed in battle. The cause is lost, Lancastrian cause is lost. She lives under house arrest in England, but in the care of her good friend, Alice Chaucer, Duchess of Suffolk. And then she is ransomed by the King of France and goes back to live in France and dies in penury. So yes, she did live in, under house arrest at one point. Elizabeth Woodville, when Edward IV died, retreated into sanctuary because she was scared of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who became protector, and very quickly took the throne. And it was her sons who were later known as the princes in the Tower. They were in the Tower, and they were never seen again after that summer.
So when it comes to sort of writing these, as you said, like a narrative or whatever, primary sources must be relatively hard to come by. I mean, how do you do, if you like, the detective work on these five women?
There is a lot in contemporary sources. They're better probably for this century than they are for the previous centuries, back to the Norman conquest. But they're nothing like they are, say, for the 1480s for Richard III's reign, nothing like they are 50 years later for Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, for example. We have a far greater wealth of source material, thanks to the invention of printing, the dissemination of knowledge, and the growth of diplomacy. So we do have ambassadorial reports, but not very many. But we do have good chronicle evidence, and we have some letters, and we have quite a lot of documentation for the 15th century. And so we do know about all these scandals. We do know about what happened to people. What we don't know exactly is what happened to the prisoners in the Tower. There are a lot of mysteries. There are a lot of room for debate here.
Are there any sort of examples of them, I don't know, petitioning the Pope or something like that, or petitioning, the Dukes of Burgundy or whatever? I mean, is there anything like that they try?
I mean, various monarchs tried to, get other monarchs and the Pope on side. We certainly got Richard of Gloucester petitioning the Pope for a very inadequate dispensation for his marriage, which effectively rendered the marriage invalid. But King's alliances are shifting all the time, bewilderingly sometimes. So yes, I mean, and the kings of France in particular, like playing off the English and English enemies, particularly in the Wars of the Roses, against each other. First, he's backing Edward IV, then he's backing the restoration of Henry VI, and the Earl of Warwick's. He's trying to reconcile the Earl of Warwick to Margaret of Anjou, and he's on his knees for hours in front of her. I mean, they like to interfere. But they were all like that. It wasn't just the French kings.
It's almost it's a national royalist pastime against the French because hey, they've had to put up with it from the English as well, thundering over there and chevauching their way through most of what's France then. Did you find a sort of if you like a binding thread then? Is there any sort of or should they all be regarded as very, because it'd be very easy to lump them all together? Oh yeah, the medieval
No, you can't, particularly Henry VI. I mean, he's Henry V, Henry IV, Henry V, Edward IV, Richard III, all political operators. Henry VI, forget it.
What are you hoping then that people are going to learn? Is it to put more flesh on the bones, give a more rounded historic? Because otherwise we're just taking this, as sort of despicable men doing despicable things to each other in the country. Is this to put to give a little more colour to the whole situation, or to actually bring the spotlight onto these women who, as we said at the beginning of the interview, have been sadly ignored because of the patriarchy, if you will?
Yes, I mean, there have been studies on them. There's no doubt about that. But what I wanted to do was bring together all the best research, my own research, and to strip away centuries of romantic mythology and the credulity of contemporary chroniclers to get at something as near the truth as we can ever hope to get after 500 to 600 years. And that's what I wanted to do.
Is this a case of blaming the Victorians again and Walter Scott? Can we have a crack at them?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Is that a case? Is it a case of sort of having a crack at the Victorians for romantic and Sir Walter Scott? Is it all their fault, basically?
Yeah. Well, the Victorians. I mean, in particular, Agnes Strickland, who wrote the Lives of the Queens of England in the 1840s and 50s, and it is hopelessly outdated, sexist, over-romanticised, and sketchy. And she didn't use all the sources that could have been available to her, and so she's quoting from old chronicles that can't even be identified now. And and because of the power of that series of books, The Lives of the Queens of England, it's taken us a long time to shake it off. To shake off the misconceptions that have happened and the Victorian moral judgments. Scripture considers it an especial odium for a handmaid to take the part of her mistress. That's the kind of language you get. And we don't look at it. We look at history objectively these days, I hope.
It only makes the question. I mean, what are you up to next then, Alison? Because this is the as you said, it's kind of the final one of this particular period. Are you turning your as the quote unquote the queen of history writing? What are you turning your attentions to next?
Well, in non-fiction, I'm actually so relieved to be doing a single subject. I'm doing a book on the scandalous marriage between Mary Tudor, Queen of France, the sister of Henry VIII, and Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, and they were the grandparents of Lady Jane Grey.
Ooh.
And it's an oft-told story, but people have often got the wrong idea about it. So I'm looking at that in some detail and what sort of autonomy princesses had in choosing their husbands. Because Mary made Henry VIII promise when he forced her to marry the King of France. She made him promise she could choose her next husband. That promise sort of went out the window.
Yeah, well, Henry VIII is an interesting, and it's those Victorians again. I'm telling you now, it's those Victorians again imposing romanticism where there isn't any.
Yeah, well, there certainly was with this marriage, certainly some romanticism, yes, but I hope to take a realistic view of it. I'm doing that, and then I'm doing a complete new version of The Six Wives of Henry VIII. I published a biography 34 years ago, and I want to update it now, but this will be a complete... I've researched the subject again for a series of 6 novels I did for Headline, and so I want to use that research. And I've done a lot of other research on them and bring a new perspective to it.
Ooh,
I'll be out in 2029.
Hopefully I'll be around for that one, because if nothing else, just to talk about, is it Jane Boleyn, the sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn, who marries Anne's brother? She's an interesting character as well through all the Henry VIII's wives.
She's very interesting character, and I'll be talking about her role too.
Excellent.
I have a lot of opinions on it.
Right, then I'll look forward to that one. But this book is called Queens at War, England's Medieval Queens. Listeners, you can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Go onto the website, you'll see the book, click on it, and a well-known delivery servant will have it rushing to your door. This book is called... Alison, if people want to follow you online, I'm not saying you TikTok in a sort of Plantagenet manner, but can people find you on social media?
They can find me on Facebook, Alison Weir Books, and on Twitter on Alison Weir Books, and Facebook, it's Alison Weir.
This book is called Queens at War. It's by Alison Weir. Alison, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Giles. Take care. Bye-bye.